What is isekai actually? Let's start with a few questions. Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid is about dragons transported from their world to the human world, and they even have overpowered abilities as a result of existing in this new world. Would you consider that to be an isekai? Is it a reverse isekai like The Devil's a Part-Timer, or is it not an isekai because our protagonist is from the human world? What about VR MMO anime like Bofuri and Full Dive? They're just playing a game and can leave at any point, but in their view it's an entirely different world. So are those isekai? Or does this only count if they can't leave the game for some reason, like in .hack and Sword Art Online? If being trapped in this new world is an important criteria, then is Inuyasha not considered an isekai because they can travel back and forth through a time-traveling well? Actually, do time travel worlds even count as isekai, like the different world lines created in Steins Gate? Or does that not count because parallel timelines aren't enough to be considered another world? What about going to heaven and hell, or traveling through space to other planets? Do they have to be reincarnated? Can they choose to go to the other world, or do they have to be forced? Is going to another world all that matters to you? Does it require a combination of commonly established isekai tropes along with being in a different world? Or do you subscribe to the term native isekai, where traveling to another world doesn't even matter, only that they're in an RPG-based fantasy world? What about Spirited Away, Flip Flappers, Gate, Tower of God, Your Name, Infinite Dendrogram, that one arc in Hunter x Hunter, which is kind of in a different world but wasn't really, or something like that? What about Kiki's Delivery Service? It's kind of a new world to her, so are Fish Out of Water stories isekai? Are transfer students isekai? What about this one weird anime short I found where you do stretches with a half-naked waifu, and at one point she says you're from the 3D world? The fuck is up with that? Is that an isekai? There's a lot of different views on what's considered an isekai, and with so much anime out there, it's hard to just stick with the term's direct translation of another world when describing the subgenre. Because when you only stick with the translation, things can get weird, like saying the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya and Dragon Ball are isekai. I mean, technically, kind of, I guess? Not really? I don't know. These days you can usually tell immediately when shows are an isekai because we have so many every season specifically catering to that audience. Most even just say it in their title. But in other cases it can be up for debate because many aren't meant to be isekai stories, but technically they could fit the loose definition of another world. Or sometimes they don't really fit that definition even though they're using a lot of isekai tropes. You know, people still argue whether or not Sword Art Online is considered an isekai, and that's the show that made the term popular in anime. Even the author has to constantly tell people Sword Art Online isn't an isekai, and he doesn't know why he's considered a pioneer of the subgenre. How the hell does that happen? And after the Mushoku Tensei anime, most isekai fans are now confused about the history of the term. Because despite its marketing calling the original series the grandfather of isekai, many of you can cite a lot of otherworld examples that came before. So what happened? How did things get this messed up? And what is an isekai really? To get into all that, we need to understand how the term came to be. Before I start, it's important to note that stories about being transported to another world were by no means started with any of the series I plan to mention. Those kind of stories can stretch all the way back to old folktales. What we're focused on here is the term isekai through the lens of anime-related works. Our story here starts not with Sword Art Online, nor Mushoku Tensei, nor .hack, nor Inuyasha, but a fantasy light novel series called The Familiar of Zero. The plot kicks off in a fantasy world where Louise the Zero accidentally summons a teenage boy from modern Japan to be her familiar. Seems like a basic premise today, but back in the late 2000s, this concept drastically affected one Japanese web novel site in particular, Shousetsuka ni Naro, which in English is Let's Become Novelists. Naro had allowed any writer to post whatever they wanted, and as a result, it eventually became a big dumping ground for fanfiction. This problem multiplied drastically when The Familiar of Zero came out, resulting in a lot of new fanfiction using the same initial premise. Unsurprisingly, there's a lot of ideas you could play with when you introduce the concept of summoning someone from another world to fanfiction writers. Before long, these type of stories were everywhere, and even the author of ReZero apparently made his start writing similar fanfiction long before his big hit series. The Familiar of Zero is definitely not the first isekai story to ever exist, but it's what made the term popular when it came to web and light novels. Not just with its own series, mind you, but its influence on many other stories on Naro as well. Before the website knew it, they were a hugely popular fanfic site flooded with all these amateur isekai stories. It got so bad that Naro had to eventually ban fanfiction, but that wasn't going to stop the writers at all. Instead, they decided to write fanfictions, but hide the fact that it was a fanfiction, like changing the names of characters, altering descriptions a bit, and even adding some unique plot elements to it. I know, what a fucking concept. And eventually you had these isekai stories that were pretty much fanfics, but not really. These became known as Naro novels, which were basically amateur stories by fanfiction writers who were essentially trying to skirt the rules of the website by introducing their own concepts into them. So if you tend to hate the writing of isekai anime, it's likely because it's actually an amateur work that blew up and got adapted. If many of them feel the same to you, it's because they came from fanfic writers inspired by each other. Or it might literally be a fanfiction in disguise. When you have so many of these stories being churned out, eventually you'll end up with an interesting idea that blows up. With their history being connected to fanfiction, the writers usually like to build on top of each other's concepts or use similar characters but in their own way. The isekai fantasy harem elements of The Familiar of Zero were taken and eventually mixed in with other ideas that became popular, like the virtual reality video game worlds of Sword Art Online. The next thing you know, a ton of isekai stories come out involving RPG worlds with game mechanics tied into them. Eventually, Mushoku Tensei came along on Naro and blew up by introducing an isekai story with reincarnation as its main addition to the growing concept. Reincarnation, while retaining your memories, was its biggest contribution to isekai, and the idea gave birth to even more isekai than before. The story was also about a guy who used to be a terrible person as a result of a miserable life who now gets a chance to restart and grow as a person. And that kind of theme, if executed well, can make for an impactful entry to the subgenre. So much so that Mushoku Tensei gained massive success as a web novel. It's largely known as the grandfather of isekai because its premise is how most isekai start these days. The main character gets reincarnated into a fantasy world. It was even the first to introduce Truckhoon, yet it gained this grandfather reputation not because it was the first to do any of these on the site, but because it also did it well. Maybe not in the beginning, but over time as the writer gained more experience, so too did its success as he pushed forward. It was a genuinely meaningful entry into this new subgenre, and it moved people. It was inspired by other isekai Naro novels before, added its own ideas into the mix, and became a big source of Naro novels that came after. This helped grow many other isekai series, which would then go on to inspire more isekai, and they all entered this never-ending fanfic writer mindset of blatantly having fun with other influences. In fact, the climactic arc of Mushoku Tensei was apparently heavily inspired by Re:Zero, which was originally inspired by Mushoku Tensei. When you look at its history with anime, you have to jump to 2012 with the release of Sword Art Online. While the story is mostly in a fantasy RPG world, one thing to realize is that it's just a video game. It's not what most would consider another world, it's just a program. But they can't leave the world or their headset will kill them. This doesn't necessarily change the fact that it's not technically another world, but to the player stuck there, it kind of is. So the debate about whether this is or isn't an isekai is a fair one to have. That said, the author himself doesn't consider Sword Art Online to be an isekai, so do with that info what you will. Yet the series is still considered a pioneer of the subgenre because its popularity led more attention back to Naro and similar kinds of stories, most of which were definitely isekai. And soon after that, we saw the beginning of the isekai boom in anime. We had The Devil's a Part-Timer, Log Horizon, No Game No Life, Overlord, Konosuba, Re:Zero, and the list just goes on and on from there. After 2012, there was no avoiding isekai anime in a season. The isekai novel boom had finally reached anime thanks to the success of Sword Art Online, and there's no going back because there's just so many of these kind of stories. These days you might think there's so much isekai anime it's getting overwhelming, but can you imagine how many web and light novels there are that haven't been adapted? At one point there were so many isekai novels that writing contests had to ban isekai entry. The problem Naro had with too many fanfictions has now become a problem of too many isekais. Although that's not really a problem for Naro because there's no legal issues involved with isekai compared to fanfiction. But it can be a problem for readers trying to find something else or for new writers to get popular with series that aren't isekai. With all this history in mind, there's not any one series or definition responsible for the birth of modern isekai anime. Instead, it's more a result of the growth of stories through the various combined influences of the writers over time. So when I say it's hard to define isekai as a term, it's because isekai is less of a setting and more of a narrative type that keeps changing, one that has a lot of similar tropes and themes surrounding them. In this way, many shows you consider to be an isekai aren't technically, while shows you wouldn't call an isekai technically are. And it all kind of depends on various factors and viewpoints that go into the term. It's this problem that makes us go from isekai to isekinda. Many define isekai as something like features characters being transported into an alternate world setting and having to adapt to their new surroundings, which can be reasonable until you start breaking this down and testing it out a bit. The biggest problem of which is how someone defines what a world is. Someone might consider Sword Art Online to be a virtual world, while others just see it as a game that isn't real. In that show, what made it feel real was the deep dive hardware and the threat of death. You might feel under those circumstances this world is also real, but to others, you're still just hooked up to a video game in a hospital bed. Let's take a look at another gaming world example, My Next Life as a Villainess. This was the protagonist's favorite otome game, which one day she found herself reincarnated into. This would more be considered an isekai than Sword Art Online because she's not trapped in a video game. Instead, the video game world she knew has become a real world. It feels like a slight philosophical difference, but with Sword Art Online, there's always that understanding that they still exist in the real world. But this isn't the case with My Next Life as a Villainess. Maybe the reincarnation part is what makes My Next Life as a Villainess more of an isekai than Sword Art Online to some of you. So let's take a look at Overlord. This was a case where the protagonist was playing a virtual reality game, but ended up stuck in it after the servers were shut down. Then he becomes trapped in this game world, which has now become a real world. Many isekai game worlds don't even have to be tied into a video game. In fact, having RPG mechanics control your isekai is an incredibly common trope. Reincarnated as a Slime, The Rising of the Shield Hero, and Konosuba are good examples of these kind of stories. They're not video game worlds, but rather worlds that use RPG systems within its physics. But now let's take a look at something like Full Dive. Here a guy buys a VR MMO that's so realistic that it's just not fun and was soon abandoned. In the game, you vividly experience things like pain, injuries, hunger, and even simulated sleep grogginess. And you can't even improve your stats outside of just improving yourself physically. For all intents and purposes, when you're in this world, it feels hyper-realistic to you in multiple ways. But at the end of the day, you can log out and leave the game. The world feels real, but it isn't actually real. So the question once again becomes, is Full Dive considered an isekai? Why or why not? And depending on your answer, you have to ask yourself how that impacts your classification of Sword Art Online. Because they're both similar cases, but the main differences are in their levels of realism and ability to leave their other world. Is Sword Art Online considered an isekai because it feels kind of real and he's trapped? Or is Full Dive considered an isekai just because he's experiencing a different world of some kind? And this is far from the only edge case when it comes to isekai definitions. That's just looking at video game worlds. What about time travel stories? Inuyasha is considered to be a popular older isekai because it's about a girl traveling from modern Japan to an older fantasy world. However, that fantasy world is actually Sengoku period Japan, meaning she only traveled back in time. And not only that, they discover she can travel back to modern Japan as well. So technically speaking, it's the same world, just at a different time period, and she's not trapped there. Is the world different enough for that to be considered an isekai? Or because it's a different time period, it doesn't count? Or do you consider the fact that she's not trapped there to be the issue? Let's take a look at another time travel example, The Disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya. This movie sees our main characters suddenly brought to an alternate timeline where events have somehow been altered so that Haruhi no longer attends their school and their club no longer exists as a result. This is essentially a different world than what he originally experienced. He's trapped in it and he has to adapt to this new setting. Is this considered an isekai, or is the world still too similar to consider it as such? What about Steins Gate, which features multiple different timelines? One of those timelines has a massive war breakout in the future that wasn't there before. Multiple of them include certain characters dying. Our protagonist has to adapt to all of them. Are these other timelines considered isekai? What about Tokyo Revengers, which is a constant back and forth of altering the timeline and seeing the drastically changing results? And if you consider time manipulation to be a form of isekai, then is ReZero like a double isekai? That's the important question here. Personally, I consider time manipulation to result in alternate worlds, so I would technically catalog time travel shows as isekai. But in a way, it kind of defeats the point of the use of the subgenre. When someone is looking for isekai anime, they aren't typically looking for shows like Steins Gate and Tokyo Revengers. Inuyasha feels like kind of a different situation because those two worlds are so different from each other that if you told me they didn't use time travel, I'd believe you. Along the lines of questioning what it means to be another world, then what about worlds as in planets? Is a space adventure show like Space Dandy or Eden Zero considered an isekai? That is to say, if I take a spaceship over to another planet, am I now in an isekai? What if that new planet happens to be a fantasy world with RPG mechanics and I crash my ship there? Now is it an isekai? This one gets a little tougher when you think about it because no matter what your answer is, you're kind of left confused at what the fuck an isekai is anymore. If you answer yes, then is moving to a new country an isekai? What about a new town or a new school? If you answer no, then what do you classify a new world to be? Are you not allowed to travel there yourself? Does it have to be a different universe? And this is where you get to a series you never thought of as an isekai before: Dragon Ball. Goku is literally sent to Earth from another planet against his will and is now an overpowered character there as a result. Initial premise aside, that show has plenty of different planets, timelines, and universes which they frequently travel between. And Heaven and Hell are different worlds there as well. Oh, and by the way, what do you consider Heaven and Hell now? Is Angel Beats an isekai because it takes place in the world of the afterlife? Not to mention the memory manipulation in that story that makes the entire thing feel like a new world to our protagonist. If you have amnesia, is anything you experience an isekai? Maybe we should take a step back and ask ourselves what transported means. Do they have to be summoned or reincarnated into the other world against their will? Like, is Gate actually an isekai, or is it not because they could choose to go there? And if that doesn't matter, then are Wonder Egg Priority and Flip Flappers considered an isekai too because they can choose to go to these other worlds? What about Combatants Will Be Dispatched or Dorohedoro? And then you have this very weird niche camp of people that use the term native isekai, which, if you haven't heard the term before, I envy you. These are the people forcing a sub-genre where it's basically just an RPG world, not set in an alternate world they were originally from.
What?
So using the term isekai to mean shows that aren't even isekai, like Redo of Healer, Goblin Slayer, and Is It Wrong to Try to Pick Up Girls in a Dungeon would be native isekai. Native isekai is one of the dumbest uses of a term I think I've ever heard in a long time, but I can understand the appeal of shows with focus on worlds with RPG mechanics. Just get a better term, guys. Jesus fucking Christ. Anyways, I could go on all day about the different kinds of exceptions or most common definitions for isekai, and what I'm ultimately trying to convey to you all is that isekai as a term isn't something that's easy to solidify. In reality, it's impossible to simply contain the subgenre in one definition. Isekai isn't the only classification with this kind of problem. For instance, many shows are considered comedies just because they have a couple jokes in it. But cases like that more depend on the amount of that classification used in the story. Isekai as a subgenre has grown to be a massive collection of tropes and narratives, many of which make this new world the plot's focus. It's also important to keep in mind what kind of show a viewer is looking for in determining what you'd consider to be an isekai. If I ask for an isekai recommendation and you tell me Dragon Ball, then you proceed to give me an essay explaining why it's an isekai, you look like a crazy person. Like a weird anime conspiracy theorist. So when you start to go down the rabbit hole of what is an isekai, there's a point where you need to realize everyone has different definitions for it, but it's largely based on what the community has come to make the term. Because as a subgenre, isekai was created through a lot of mashing up of different concepts, and before we knew it, the term came into existence. Then we blinked and the anime industry made it into a marketing tool for years to come, selling escapism to otakus who didn't really care about what the term exactly encompassed, only that they could enjoy it. In the end, I guess that's all that matters. You shouldn't have to worry about whether or not what you're experiencing is an isekai, only that you enjoy it. Well, what I'm really trying to say is Sword Art Online just isn't an isekai, guys, okay? Just stop it, alright? It's not an isekai. You don't need it to be considered an isekai to like it. Just stop already. You've all been wrong for years, and you just don't want to admit it. I'm giving you an out here, and you can just take it and leave. It's not a fucking isekai. The author doesn't even consider it an isekai. Just stop. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe to the channel, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter, and talk to me on Discord. And as a bonus challenge, if you leave a comment with your own definition of isekai below, I'll try to give you examples or reasons for why that doesn't work. That's all for now. I'll talk to you all later.